Is it possible for God not to exist? That is it necessary for God to exist? That is the subject of the chapter we're going over in the book, The Concept of God. This is our last chapter. And we're going to throw in the summary too, chapter 10. We're on chapter 9 right now. And the question is God necessary? But one of the questions that Nash brings up is, what does it mean to be necessary? There are two ways he describes that or defines that in this chapter. Number one, there is a logical necessity he talks about. And that kind of necessity is about stuff like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or a triangle having 3 sides and adding up to 180 degrees. That's just necessary. That's just logically the way it is. So to be logically necessary is to say there is no logical way God can't exist, or it would be a logical contradiction for God not to exist. So that is what's meant by logical necessity. The other kind of necessity is factual necessity. And Nash says there are 3 ingredients to something being factually necessary in this kind of context. 1, God would be eternal. That being would be eternal. 2, the being would be self-caused. And 3, everything else that exists depends upon the necessary being for its existence. All right. For logical necessity, you could keep number 1, that God is eternal, and number 3, that everything else depends on it. That is that God is aseity. We talked about divine aseity. That is God existing completely independently from everything else that exists. Number 2, though, is kind of strange in that he calls us being self-caused. I've never heard anybody call God self-caused. There are 3 ways a thing can be caused. It can be uncaused, caused by another, or self-caused. Well, self-caused is a contradiction because you'd have to exist in order to cause yourself, which is the status of contradiction. God wouldn't be caused by another because he's the ultimate cause of all other things that exist, so he would have to be uncaused. So I take issue with this notion of being self-caused. That's that contradiction. I'm not sure why he says that. He should do better than that. Another difference, he says, a key difference is between a logical and factual necessity is a factually necessary being does not exist in all possible worlds, he says. So a logical being would logically have to exist across all possible worlds. Again, a possible world is just a possible way things could exist. They're not real worlds unless you're David Lewis. Most philosophers don't think that these possible worlds are actual, or they wouldn't be possible. They'd be actual, or actualized, I guess. But most philosophers take these possible worlds to just be ways of talking, a heuristic device, as Bill Craig once said. He says, in the sense of factual necessity, the proposition God does not exist is not logically false or contradictory. A factually necessary being is in a sense accidental. That's a strange way of putting it. This necessity of someone accidental. How can you have in this regard accidental necessity? There are different ways of talking about necessity, and there is a kind of these kind of accidental necessities in the sense of, well, it doesn't have to be that way, but it is, or because it is, it just is that way. That's a strange way of talking about the ultimate being, though, I think, being necessary. He does mention a few objections to this logical notion of necessity. Namely, it boils down, it seems, to if something is logically necessary, then you really can't state the contradiction of that view. So you can't say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and doesn't equal 4. So saying that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4 would be a contradiction. So some philosophers will say that, well, people deny God's existence all the time, so then the denial of such existence wouldn't be logically contradictory. And as Nash says, that's kind of my word on his naive. Just because you can state something doesn't mean that it's not. I mean, someone could very well deny things that are logically necessary in this definitional sense. So this kind of logical notion is a definitional notion. That God is necessary in this kind of logical, this definitional way. So I don't like either one of these notions of necessity he's talking about. God being a necessary being is a classical traditional view of God. And there have been people who have held to a logical notion of God. For example, the most well known would be Anselm. Anselm, in the famous ontological argument for God's existence, Anselm lived in the 11th century into the 12th century. And he was a monk, and his fellow monks asked him to give an argument for God's existence that did not require the use of scripture. And so he gave the famous ontological argument, again, ontos from the word being in Greek. And the argument goes like this: God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. In other words, you can't think of anything better than God. It is better to exist not just in the mind, but also in reality, extramentally. Therefore, God must exist outside the mind or have external objective existence. And the thought goes like this, and it does boil down to a contradiction. And some said, well, if you can conceive of a being greater than a being that's just in the mind, and God just exists in the mind, then you can conceive of a being outside the mind that's greater than God. But then you're saying you can conceive of a being greater than the being that nothing can be conceived greater than. So that's a flat out contradiction. And so he's trying to make this argumentum ad absurdum, this argument to absurdity, arguing that, well, you cannot maintain that God is the greatest conceivable being and also not say he exists, because you can say he can exist outside the mind or exist in reality. If he didn't exist in reality, then you could conceive of a greater being, but you can't conceive of a greater being than the greatest conceivable being. So it's a contradiction. Now, theologians and philosophers have debated this argument. Even those who believe in theism and who hold to God, even some of his fellow monks, argued against this argument. It's been a very contentious argument throughout the centuries. Made popular again by Alvin Plantinga, who brought possible worlds into that argument and made a modal version of the ontological argument. But I think another way of looking at necessity with God is a way which is ironic here, because Nash is trying to pit two different views of God together, Thomism and process theology. And he doesn't give the Thomistic view here, which is strange. Not surprising, I guess, but it's somewhat strange. There's a lot of books. Thomism is kind of ignored in a lot of books. For example, there's a book on 6 views on God and abstract objects. Not one of them is a moderate realist view in the vein of, say, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. You got these different nuanced views, and none of them really approach the Thomistic view. So that view just largely gets ignored. But it's kind of surprising in a book that's talking about Thomism and Thomistic views of God. I think that just shows that Nash wasn't very familiar with didn't appreciate the Thomistic view anyway in that regard. Another way of looking at divine necessity here, the Thomistic view, would be that God is necessary in the metaphysical sense. In this regard, it wasn't just that God is logically necessary. For example, Aquinas rejected the Anselmian ontological argument. Not that he disagreed that the notion God exists is kind of logically tight, but because it is somewhat definitional, because for Aquinas, God just is existence. So to say God exists is to say existence exists, in a sense. So it is somewhat definitionally just a truism or a tautology, as it were. But Aquinas rejected that because he said not everybody agrees with that definition. So he says we can't just define God into being. We have to demonstrate God's existence, not from some a priori rationalistic way of looking at God from a definitional point of view, but rather we have to look at the nature of reality, the universe around us, and then reason backwards from the effect to the cause and see if there is a cause and what that cause is like. Much like Paul says in Romans 1, we know God through creation, through what has been made. So Aquinas says that we have these, one of his arguments, for example, is that everything in our experience is contingent, meaning that it doesn't have to exist or that it's not necessary. So the trees around us, you and me, the books you see behind me, if you're watching the video, anything in our experience doesn't have to be. It's possible for it not to exist. There's nothing about us or the world around us that has to exist. Putting aside some debates about whether or not God had to create, I think God created freely and did not have to create. But if everything else is contingent, changing, material, and all that, then everything would require a cause ultimately, because you can't go back into the causal past to infinity. There's got to be some ultimate cause that itself is not contingent, because if it were contingent, then it too would need a cause. So there's got to be something in the causal series of events that is not contingent and therefore is necessary. So it's not simply a logical way of talking about necessity. It's not simply a factual way here that well, just is the case, but it's a metaphysical necessity, meaning that contingent being requires a necessary being, or you would result in an infinite regress into the causal past, which is impossible. So you have this whole nother way of looking at God, this whole tradition that's ignored in this book, that says that God is necessary, not just in a definitional sense, not just from these possible world semantics or whatever you Nash and others want to say, that God just does happen to exist. I'm not even sure how God would exist. Or I'm sorry, I'm not sure how a possible world would exist without God existing. This is one of the problems with possible worlds, is you really understand the nature of what's possible or not, and not really from the possible world, but from the actual world. Then it just kind of gets imported to the possible worlds. Then it becomes somewhat circular and just arbitrary, and you just don't need it. One of my favorite comedians is Stephen Wright, and he says, "I just bought a new digital camera. It's really advanced. You don't even need it." Well, if these worlds, if you don't have to look to the possible worlds to figure out what's possible and necessary, then you don't really need them. That's one of the criticisms against them. How could a world be possible without an ultimate cause? It's not really possible. So yes, God is necessary. Is necessary in the metaphysical sense, not just in the logical sense, or these kind of quote unquote factual senses. Now that pretty much wraps up the book that we've looked at. Let's look at the summary though. In chapter 10, I just want to say one thing about chapter 10, which is a summary of the whole book. It's only about 2.5 pages. He basically just summarizes the book that he gives and says that there are problems with both the Thomistic and the process views of God, and there's got to be some kind of other position. This is not unlike what Richard Creel argues for in his Divine Impassibility, an essay in philosophical theology. In fact, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on him because what he wanted to do, that is Creel, he wanted to make a middle ground or a third way between Aquinas and Hartshorne. And I just don't think you can do that personally. There are really only two views of God. There's a view of God that's God is pure actuality, like Aquinas says. And then there's a view of God where God is act and potency. And it might not be a full-blown process theology where God is somewhat dependent on the universe and this kind of interplay back and forth. I'm not saying that. But if God has potentiality and he's changing, like many evangelicals say, well, if God is changing, then there is a real sense in which he's in a process. It might not be exactly as full-blown as the process theologians say, that God is somewhat dependent and reliant on the universe, but God is still in some kind of a process. And that means that it's just the opposite view of Thomism and what's called the classical view of God, that God is simple, immutable, eternal, and impassible. Well, if you deny one, you're denying all those pretty much. And so I do think, as Norm Geisler said, there's really only two views of God. God is pure actor, God is act and potency. So I hope you've enjoyed the study on this book. I'll put the link to it if you haven't got it yet in the description. If you haven't listened to the rest of the other videos, they'll be in a playlist on this topic. And I hope you have enjoyed it and learned something. Feel free to ask questions, make comments, like and share and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.